Okay, so we are going to quickly go over 2.04, 2.05, just to make sure that you guys get more time in class to ask questions and do actual work, rather than listening to us and go through the activities and taking up more time than you need. So we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson. He was he was the draftsman of the Declaration of Independence. First Secretary of State, second Vice President, third President. Very crucial person to the foundation of our country. Born to, his mother was royalty from English and Scottish descent. Dad is a prominent plantation owner, cartographer, so he made maps. So he came from a good upbringing, had a great schooling, was classically trained, knew many languages, and could play instruments. Was a lot of literature training as well. Went to a prominent college. It was the second oldest after Harvard. Got bored there, so then he started shadowing a lawyer and became a lawyer. Not just a lawyer, like one of the most prominent lawyers in the colonies. Became a lawyer, became a very good lawyer, and then essentially became active in politics when he got fed up with King George. At that point, he was then invited to, he was then invited to, there we go. He was invited to write the Declaration of Independence. And so when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he thought that he needed to explain why the colonies needed to break away from Britain. He argued that people are born with rights such as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. He felt that if your government was not actively protecting those rights, then the people have the right to start a new government. It was called the Declaration of Independence. It had 5 parts. One of the most crucial pieces of the foundation of our nation took 2 weeks to write. That's it, 2 weeks. When he finished his draft, he had 4 other people help him edit it. So it took 5 people to edit one of the most important documents in American history. Pretty amazing. So the first piece of the Declaration is the preamble, similar to an introduction. States why the Declaration is being written, which was to explain why the colonies must break away from England, or Britain. He felt that to break away from your government and start a new one, you had to have good reasons. This is just a quote from the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Basically, if you're going to leave your home country's government and start your own new government, you need to list all of the reasons that you are separating. Alright, so what is the main purpose of the Declaration of Independence? Just said it. It's the official statement of separation from Great Britain. The second piece of the Declaration of Independence is the Declaration of Rights. And so that is where they state that people have rights that cannot be taken away. All people are equal. All people have rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Government tries to take those rights away from people. The people have the right to change the government, start a new government, and give those rights to the people. So instead, essentially, he was giving all the rights to the people and not King George. My favorite part is the Bill of Indictments, the 3rd section. It's a list of all the reasons why King George III is a terrible guy. I just think it's kind of entertaining that they just put an entire list. It's the longest section of the Declaration of Independence, and it talks about all the complaints they have against the king. And then it ends by them saying that he is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. If you're looking at the persuasive technique that he uses within the Declaration of Independence, he starts off broad. So you'll see right here at the bottom, he starts off broad, just says that, he's not acknowledging certain laws, and then he gets a little more in depth, and then a little more in depth. So that's his persuasive technique, is he starts off broad and he gets very specific. So he refuses to acknowledge the laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good laws, and then they say he plunders the seas and ravages the coasts, and then he is transporting armies of foreign mercenaries to kill everybody. Main purpose of the indictment: to document the offenses of Great Britain against the American people. Statement of Independence. The fourth section argues that the colonies have to be free to protect their rights. It talks about how the colonists, it states that they have independence from Britain, that they have 13 states that have the right to make war, peace, trade, and do all things that a normal free country can do. The fifth section is the last section. It was the bottom. It's where everybody signed. So the delegates to the Second Continental Congress signed their names. This is where that famous John Hancock signed with the large print so that everybody could read his name. He was the president of the Congress. He felt that if you were too embarrassed or too scared to sign your name, that you shouldn't even basically sign it. So he signed it perfectly legible so everybody knew that he was a member of the Continental Congress. Shockingly, July 4th, 1776 was when it was voted in and accepted by the Second Continental Congress. It was signing the declaration was considered treason to Britain, which is why some people signed it as scribbles, so that their families would be safe. So treason is when you go against your government. Even with the threat of treason, delegates still signed it, and then the declaration was read aloud to the crowds all over the colonies. People cheered and then tore down statues of King George. They were over him. Declaration of Independence marked the moment when the Americans chose to rule themselves, which you should know because, we celebrate that day still. Who was the author? This is just a quick recap. Who was the author? Thomas Jefferson. When and where was it written? Philadelphia, 1776. What was the purpose or goal? It was to officially confirm that they are no longer a part of Great Britain. Who were the audience that he had in mind? He had a few different people. So the people that supported independence, the people who did not support independence, King George, and then the British people. He wanted all of them to read his document. All right. Now, going over and looking at the other authors in 2.05, Olaudah Equiano is the first author that we're going to talk about. He was captured and enslaved when he was 11 years old, sold to various different owners. He worked on a plantation in Barbados, sailed with a British naval officer, managed the business for a merchant in Philadelphia, and then eventually bought his freedom. He worked as a sailor for many years, settled in England, and then became very active in abolition. He published his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. Readers were horrified when they learned of the conditions that he and other slaves encountered on the ship, and he spent much of his time going around and promoting his book to help the cause for abolition. He encouraged people to read it so they could see a first-hand account of what life was really like for slaves. And so a part of the reading that we're reading from him is aboard a slave ship. And he talks about his own experience on the slave ship. And it's an experience that was shared by hundreds of thousands of slaves over the course of centuries. And what was the topic of this selection? The living conditions on a slave ship. It talked about how horrible they were. So this is just a quick little passage from aboard a slave ship. And so when you go in and read it, you can read the bigger selections from it. But just right here, at last, when the ship we were in had got all her cargo, they made ready with fearful noises, and we were all put under the deck so we could not see how they managed the vessel. He is a part of the ship's cargo. So you see the way he says it. We were in, had gotten all her cargo. Basically, he's calling himself a piece of cargo, not a human at that point. His story, first person point of view. He's an eyewitness, which makes it a reliable narrator. He lived the events, which makes him an expert on it. He can tell us things that no one else can because he was there and experienced them. So the first object I saw when I arrived on the coast of West Africa was the sea. A slave ship waiting for its cargo. This filled me with astonishment, soon terror. I wished for the last friend of death to relieve me. I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. The shrieks of women and the groans of the dying made the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable. So he saw other slaves throw himself overboard to escape what they saw. And so he talked about how he had wanted to kill himself at times. He used vivid imagery to try to get the average person who was reading his story to feel empathy for him and the other slaves. Talking about Phillis Wheatley, she was born in West Africa as an 8-year-old girl, was purchased by John Wheatley, who was a tailor. They recognized her intelligence, taught her to read and write, and this was very unusual at that time. Most slave owners feared literacy, so you know how in here they talked about how they were taught put underneath so they couldn't manage the vessel. They did not want the slaves to be educated so that they could be free. They wanted to keep them as uneducated as possible. Her family did not agree with that. They taught her. Her first poem was published when she was 13, and in 1773, at around 19 or 20, she published poems on various subjects, religious and moral. He freed the young literary celebrity the same year, and she died in 1784. So what was unusual about her slave owners? They taught her to read and write. And so if you're looking at the poems and you're wondering how they're similar and how they're different, essentially her poems are not necessarily showing slavery in a negative light. So I'm being brought from Africa to America, Phillis Wheatley's, she talks kind of about how she was introduced to God and she was thankful for it. Being aboard a slave ship, there was not much positive happening there, right? So they both talk about how they wanted freedom and slavery wasn't the best thing. But over here was a more positive spin on it because she felt that without having been a slave, she would have never been introduced to God, and she has a healthy relationship with God. All right, so that is it. 13 minutes, you're welcome. I will see you tomorrow, and we will do activities for the class.